Welcome to How to Install and Configure AWS CLI on macOS Part 2. In this video, we will go through how to configure the CLI so that it will properly connect to your AWS account. If you have not installed AWS CLI, I would encourage you to watch Part 1. So in this video, we'll go through four things. First is using the Configure command. Second is using the named profile. Third is environment variables. And finally, we'll talk about the configuration precedence if you're using multiple methods to configure your AWS CLI. If you're following along this tutorial, you will need macOS computer and an AWS account. If you don't already have an AWS account, you can get a free one at aws.amazon.com/free. So at a high level, AWS CLI is a Python-based application. We'll be using the terminal application that's already installed in your macOS as a primary interface to issue commands to AWS services. In this tutorial, we'll be looking at how to configure the AWS CLI using the built-in configuration that comes with CLI, as well as using the bash configuration. So let's get started. Okay, in this video, we are going to connect AWS CLI to the AWS account. And we're going to authenticate to the AWS account using the first technique, which is AWS Configure Command. Now this command will prompt you for various information to ensure that you are indeed who you say you are. So first thing it's going to ask you in this method is the access key. Now, if you don't have access key, you can create one. So I'll show you very quickly how to do this. You can log on to your console, and in your IAM, I'll show you how to create this access key and secret key. Now, I have a couple of users already on my account, and I'll go ahead and just use my admin account. Now, it is highly recommended that you do not use your root user account. Always create a separate IAM user account to do things like this. So I'll go ahead and use my admin account user. So in order to create the secret key, you can go to security credential and click on this create access key. And when you do this, it'll create the access key and secret key for you. Now, you should never share this information, but I'll go ahead and share it now just so you can see how this works. So essentially, when you do this, you can copy this access key, and then you can paste it here. And then the second thing it'll ask you is the secret key. The secret key is this long text right here, so I'll copy that. And then the third thing it'll ask you is a region name. Now the region is, I'll post this page, but basically there's various regions in AWS, and some are applicable for various services, but you can see from here the various region code that you can use. I'll go ahead and use a US West 2 for this demo. And then the last thing it'll ask you is the default output format. The valid values here are JSON, text, or table. This is just an indication of how you want this CLI to respond to you. It has no bearing on the actual functionality itself. So I'll just use JSON. So once you're in here, you can start issuing commands. So one of the first thing I can do is AWS, and I can issue a command like IAM get user. Now this tells me who I am currently authenticated as, and give you some information about the username and so forth. And by the way, if you do this command and you get an error, it may mean that the user that you are authenticated with does not have the permission for the IAM get user. In order to do this, if you're an admin user, then you'll have this. But if you are logging in as a non-admin user who do not have all this permission, I'll just show you real quickly. So for example, if I logged in as Bob, unless I have this IAM read-only access permission, added to the user or a group that this user is part of, you won't be able to issue commands like IAM get user. So that's just a quick troubleshooting step in case you're trying to follow this demo. Some of the other things you can do is like, you can start working with your resources. So for example, you can say AWS S3, and I want to list a list of buckets that are currently in my account. Just to demonstrate that this is actually true, I can go to my S3 buckets here. And you can see that indeed the two buckets that are showing in my console does match the results from the command that I issue here. So this is where the real power of the CLI comes in. So for example, you can do things like I want to make a new bucket, AWS S3, make bucket S3, and then I want to create a bucket like Stuzio bucket dash demo 3, and you can see that this command will make a bucket, and I can say AWS S3 list, and there it is. There's my demo 3 bucket. Now, did it really work? Now I can go back to my console and refresh this page here, and you should see that there's indeed my demo 3 bucket. So it actually created the bucket just by issuing that command. So you can see how powerful this can be. So that just gives you a quick feel for some of the things you can do, and you can practically do everything that you can do in the console through the CLI command. So it's a very powerful tool. To summarize, what I really just showed you is first step, which is how to authenticate into your AWS account using the AWS Configure command. And it requires entering these 4 information, then you can start using the command. In this video, we will talk about authenticating to AWS from AWS CLI using profiles. Now, if you've been following along in this series, last time we connected to AWS using the AWS Configure command. So we did AWS Configure, and we entered these 4 information. And once we do that, we were able to connect. Before we get into the profile, take a look at this, what I just did here. It seems like somehow this AWS CLI remembered the information that I had entered last time, namely the access key, secret key, and region and output format. Well, how did this thing remember what I did? Where is this information stored? And that's where the profile comes in. So to answer that question, let's take a quick look at this set of files that AWS uses. So if you go to your Finder and navigate to your home directory, in my case, it's Stuzio. That's the user that I'm logged in as on my iOS. And if you go into this hidden directory called .aws, and again, if you don't see these hidden directories in your Finder, you can just do a Shift Command dot period, and it'll just toggle the hidden file for you. And once you do that, you'll see this directory called .aws, and in there are 2 files called config and credential. And these are just simple text files. But so if I just open this credential, you can see that under this default profile, and this is an example of a profile, it actually saved the access key and secret key. And indeed, this is really where this is coming from. And also under the config file, it saved the region and output. So this is how the CLI is able to recall the information that you entered. Now let's do something here. Let's just clear all this and see what happens here. Let's clear this file and save it. And let's also just delete everything here and save it. And let's come back to this command and just say AWS Configure. you'll see now it doesn't know. It forgot what you entered last time because we just cleared those 2 entries in the files. So now it's none. So let's start the profile example now. So let's pretend that I am an employee of a company and my name is Bob. So as a Bob, I have a set of credentials that I'm given to connect to our account, AWS account. So just like we did last time, if I went into the the AWS console and I have these users here, now I'm talking about authenticating as Bob. So as a Bob, I will have a set of access key and secret key that has been created for me. And that is the credential I'm going to use to connect from my AWS CLI. So let's go ahead and do that. So back in my AWS console, I would now enter the key for Bob. The region, I'll go ahead and use US West -2. And then output format, I'll go ahead and use JSON again. Now, notice when I do this, let's just quickly check my files again. Did it save my Bob's profile? And indeed it did. So what AWS CLI does is every time you use this configure command, it saves whatever you entered in here as a default profile. This is how you're able to, this thing is able to recall whatever you entered last time because it saves this information as a default. So now when I authenticate, now I can do the same kind of thing that I did before. You can say AWS IAM get user, and now it tells me I'm Bob, and I'm good to go. Now, in this case, Bob has slightly different permission than the admin, obviously. So let's take a quick look at that. So Bob cannot do everything that the admin can do. And namely, Bob can only do a read-only access to IAM, which is the reason why I'm able to issue commands like AWS IAM get user. But in terms of resources, Bob can only read-only access. So, Bob cannot make bucket, Bob cannot delete buckets and things like that. So that's a policy that a company may have rolled out. Bob may be a developer. This may be a production account, and Bob cannot delete or make changes to buckets. And that's just how it works. Let's talk about profile, because now there are cases where Bob may have need to authenticate as an admin. Perhaps Bob is working as a production support, and Bob has a legitimate need to be able to make some changes with higher privileges. So in that case, Bob says, you know what, I have to log in as admin, and I've been given this additional access key and secret key that lets me log in as admin. But Bob says, you know what, it's really annoying having to type this in every single time. I want to create a profile on my machine that lets me log in as admin when I need to. But most of the time, I'm going to just go ahead and work as a Bob because that's really my day job. So let's talk about that. How do we create a profile on Bob's machine that lets him kind of toggle back and forth working as Bob and as admin? This is where profile comes in. So it's really easy. What Bob would need to do is just type AWS Configure, but I would say in this case, I'm going to create a profile called my admin profile. What this does is it creates an entry in that the 2 files, and I'll show you what this looks like. So I'll go ahead and enter the admin profile. So in our case, the admin profile is this, and secret key for admin is this, and for admin is still US West, and output is, I'll just keep it same as JSON. Okay, so now what just happened? If I did AWS IAM get user, okay, it says I'm still Bob. But let's take a look at our config file. So if I went back into my Finder, if I look at my credential, look at that. It created another entry in my credential file called myadmin. So now there are two different sets of credentials stored in this file, namely one that's default, which is Bob, and I have this second profile created called myadmin. This is the admin profile that I could use to log in as admin if I need to. And same thing happens in the config. It now has two sets of configuration. How do I actually use these two profiles? Now, I can say that, for example, I want to say AWS, and I'm working with the resources S3 list, and that's fine. But now if I want to switch my privilege, and I actually want to issue this command as admin, all I have to do is say AWS S3 list profile my admin. What this just did is it issued the exact same command, but using a profile called myadmin. So it now, the CLI looked at those config files and credential files and says, okay, there is a myadmin profile, and it uses that. So let's just make sure this is really true. For this demo, Bob can only read S3, but the admin can actually do anything with S3. Admin can make buckets. So let's try this. So now I can say AWS S3, okay, and I want to create a bucket called com.stuzio bucket -bob demo. Okay, so because I am currently authenticated as Bob, this should fail because Bob cannot make buckets. So let's see what happens here. And indeed, AWS did the right thing here. It says Bob cannot make bucket. But let's say I'm in the production support or some other use case where I really need to create this bucket and I'm Bob. So I can issue this exact same command. And now this time I want to say profile myadmin. Okay. So now I'm telling the AWS CLI that, hey, I want to create this bucket, but use my profile, saved profile called myadmin. This should succeed because myadmin is indeed a admin privileged user. And look at that, it actually worked. So you can see that even though I am currently logged in as Bob, I can always append this -- profile myadmin, and now I can issue command as an admin privileged user. So now in this case, I can say AWS S3 list, and indeed the Bob demo bucket exists. And just to make sure that it's actually working, I can go back to my S3, and there it is. Bob demo bucket now got created. Okay, so let's summarize AWS CLI profile. The profiles are stored in these two files that are located in the .aws hidden file, and there are two files, config and credential. And in here are a set of profiles that you can use when you authenticate into AWS from the CLI. In order to create these profile, you can issue a command AWS Configure -- profile, and then you can create whatever named profile you want. And you can create as many of these as you need to. In order to use these profile, you can always append the profile to any of your commands. So if you're doing AWS S3 list, you can always say, I want to use the named profile by typing in your stored profile, and this command will now execute using the profile that you specify. In this video, we're going to be using environment variables to configure the AWS CLI. So what are environment variables? Environment variables are simply some values that are stored in memory for your operating systems to use. So if you want to see what are your current environment variables, you can open terminal application like this, and type print environment. And it'll tell you the various environment variables that are currently set on your computer. So this is basically a set of variables and values that are currently set in your computer. So how can we use this for configuring our AWS CLI? So if you recall, when we set up our configuration using profile, you might have recalled that in our the two files, the credential and configuration file, is stored in our multiple profiles, the various access key and regions and output format. You might say, hey, you know what? This is nice and handy, but what I really want to do is just, there are cases when I just want to override all of this stuff. So let's just use the output format as an example. And this might be a trivial one, but it'll demonstrate how this works. So let's say that currently all your profiles are set with the output JSON format. So what that really means is if you say something like AWS IAM get user, it's going to return the response in a JSON format. And you might say, you know what, this is nice and handy, but I want everything returned to me in table, and I don't want to go and have to override all these values in my configuration file. So what could you do? One way you could do it is you could say AWS IAM get user, and then you say dash output is table. And voila, what just happened there? It just responded the output of this command in a tabular format. But you don't want to keep doing this on every single command to get the output format in table. So one way you could do this is just set this one time in an environment variable. So AWS CLI basically has a set of environment variables that it understands. The one we're going to use for this example is called AWS default output. So you could set a variable like AWS default output equals table. Now what just happened here? If I say echo AWS default output, and it just set the variable. So now if I say print environment, I should see in one of these entries the AWS value that I just set. And there it is right there. So now what? What this means is that from now on in this session, if I say AWS IAM get user command, the response is going to come in a tabular format, even though my profile has output set to JSON, because the environment variable that's set to table overrides the configuration that's set in the profile. If you wanted to now override this again, you could say AWS IAM get user output JSON, and it'll go back to JSON, but now it's just for this command. So you can see that the environment variables can override the settings that are set in your configuration file. Now, one other thing that's a little bit annoying about this is even though you set your environment variables, if you close out of this, let's say, and you open a brand new terminal, I want to go back to where I was, the environment variable that you set, it won't be there because it was saved for that session. Next day, when you reboot your computer, you're kind of back to square one again. How do you resolve that? What if you're really wanting to store these environment variables permanently on your computer, so even after rebooting, all these configurations come back up? One way to do that is to use the bash profile. So if you recall in the earlier session where we were installing and configuring, one of the things we talked about was using this bash profile file. And so this bash profile is stored in your root directory. It's one of the hidden files. So if you open up your bash profile, you can see that there are these command lines, and this basically gets executed every time your terminal application starts up. So one of the things you could do here is you could set some configuration files directly here. Let's try that. So let's say you really want to log in as a particular user every time. And you don't even want to do the configure the profile. So one thing you could do is say, you know what, I'm just going to set this here one time. Say export AWS access key. And this is one of the known environment variables. And I'm going to set that as a particular user that I know that exists on my account. And here it is. So I'm going to set my account here, access key here. And another thing I'm going to set is secret key. Now, again, you should never be sharing these things, but I'm just showing it to you now so you can see how this works. So let's say I save this. Okay, now it's saved. Now what happens? Let's say I clear out of this. I open up my terminal application again. Now, what would just happen? Who am I right now? Do I even have to do AWS Configure? So if I say AWS IAM get user, look at that. I am Jane. Because even though Jane is not even configured as one of my profile, I didn't do anything. Because AWS CLI understands the environment variables, it automatically read my Jane, access key and secret key from the environment variables, authenticated me directly like this. This is a demonstration of how you could use the environment variables. So setting environment variables, you can do it two ways. You can do it on your session just by typing export and environment variables. Or if you wanted to do something more permanent, you could come in here in your folder, and under the root directory, your home directory, you could set this thing in the bash profile. This way, every time you open up your terminal application, this thing gets set. So if you want to know what are all the different possible environment variables that AWS CLI understands, it is right here in this little page. I can post the URL. But you can see here that these are the various environment variables that AWS CLI understands. We tried the secret access key. We also tried the output, okay? And you can even do this with AWS Profile. So if you say, you know what, I have a whole bunch of profiles here, right, that are saved in my AWS config file, and I just always want to use particular profile. Instead of trying to set that every time you open up your terminal application, you could set the default profile one time in your environment variables, and it'll always pick up that profile when you authenticate. One of the things to understand when configuring AWS CLI is the precedence of the various configuration options. So far we talked about a couple different ways, and I'll just use this web page here as a reference. And I'll post this page, but this kind of explains the idea. You can always use the command line option, and this will always override anything else you have set up, whether it's in environment variables or your credential files that are part of the AWS subfolder, credential files or configuration files. And then the environment variables will override the credential files. So let me just demonstrate how this works. So right now, and I'll just use this output as an example. So right now, JSON as an output format on my profile. So when I authenticate like this, and I don't have anything set up my environment variables or anything like that. So if I say AWS IAM get user, what format is going to come back? Well, it's going to come back to me in a JSON format because that's what is set up on my AWS configuration. Now I can always override the configuration that's set up in my profile by appending the command right on the parameter right on the command. So if I can say AWS IAM get user -- output equals table, well then guess what? I'm going to get the result in the table because this, by appending this right on my command, this overrides anything that's set on my configuration file or even in environment files. So, but now what happens if I set an environment variable? Then what? Just to demonstrate, I'll go ahead and update my bash file. And I'll go ahead and just append to it this output format okay? And I'll just append to it the environment variable of output equals to table. Now, if I save this and I come back here, now if I do this again without this command option, what's going to happen? Well, it still comes back in JSON because right now it is not aware of this environment. So let's exit out of here and open a new one. And let's say I want to do that again. IAM get user. Now what happens? Now it comes back in a tabular format, even though I did not specify the output equals table on my command. Because why? The environment variable overrides the configuration variables that are in the AWS profile. So that's how the precedence works. The environment variables override the configuration, AWS profile configuration file. And then even though this is all set, I can always override both of these things by appending to my command. Let's say I'll do text. Okay, this is the third option I could do. Now what just happened here? The response came back to me in text and it overrode both the environment variable and the configuration profile setting. This is important to understand if you use multiple techniques to configure the AWS CLI. So let me go back to the web page. And so you can understand now that command line option is always takes precedence. And then the environment variables takes precedence after that, and then the CLI configuration, credential files, and there's some other things. But you can get the idea here of what options take precedence over what. So that's how the precedence work when you're configuring the AWS CLI.